I'm 29 now, and I've been through plenty of disturbing moments in my life, but nothing has ever embedded itself in my mind the way one night from when I was 15 has. It was my first legitimate babysitting job, one that went beyond watching a cousin for a short while my aunt ran errands. This was for close family friends, the kind where both sets of parents know each other well, and everyone assumes there's an automatic layer of safety. They've given me permission to share this story publicly. Their names are Mark and Diane, and their son, Charlie, was 5 years old at the time. They lived in a pleasant house, in a calm, ordinary neighborhood. Looking back now, that normalcy is part of what made the experience linger. It didn't feel like a place where anything bad could happen. It felt familiar, like the neighborhood I grew up in. It was a Friday evening in early fall. My parents dropped me off around 6:30, and Mark and Diane were already dressed to go out. Mark shook my hand with the seriousness of someone conducting a job interview. Diane kept thanking me, calling me a lifesaver. They went over the routine: what time Charlie eats, what he eats, when bedtime is, and the importance of leaving his bedroom door slightly open. If he needed the bathroom at night, I was to walk him there because he sometimes got scared of the hallway. Mark also explained the door locks. The front door had a lock they rarely used since they usually entered through the garage. The back door, however, was the one I'd use if I needed to step onto the deck. He mentioned that it had two locks that both needed to be secured, a deadbolt at the top and a standard lock beneath it. I nodded, assuming it was straightforward. A lock was a lock. They left shortly after 7. Once their car disappeared down the street, Charlie immediately asked if we could play board games and hide and seek. I tried to steer him away from hide and seek because the house was larger than I expected, and I didn't want him hiding somewhere unsafe and getting hurt. We settled on a basic card matching game at the coffee table, followed by a video game on the small console in the family room. It was one of those kid-friendly games where you mostly run around collecting items, and the character can't really lose. Around 7:45, I warmed up the dinner Diane had prepared: mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, the ultimate babysitting shortcut. Charlie ate in front of the TV, which I suspected wasn't usually allowed. But I didn't want to be overly strict on my first paid job. After dinner, we brushed his teeth and headed upstairs to his bedroom. His room was on the second floor, at the end of a wide hallway that passed a couple of bedrooms and a bathroom. His room had a small closet with sliding doors. Earlier, when he'd grabbed a toy, I'd noticed it mostly held kids' clothes and a few storage bins on the top shelf. There was also a tall hamper with a lid tucked into the corner near his dresser. A nightlight on the dresser cast a soft yellow glow across the room. I tucked him in and read him a short book. As I was leaving, he asked if I could stand in the hallway for a minute. I waited outside his door, listening as he moved around for about 30 seconds. When everything went quiet, I assumed he'd settled down. I left his door slightly open, just like his parents instructed. Diane had shown me the guest bedroom, where I could relax once Charlie was asleep. It was farther down the hallway, closer to the stairs. The room had a small TV, clearly a spare, and a neatly made bed with a comforter that looked untouched. I turned on the TV and flipped through channels until I landed on a random show. I lay on top of the bed, kicked off my shoes, and kept my phone in my pocket. It felt like the hard part of the night was over, but that feeling didn't last long. About 40 minutes later, as I half-watched the TV, I heard light footsteps in the hallway. I looked up to see Charlie standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed animal and rubbing his eyes. He didn't look sleepy. He looked frightened. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't step inside right away. He just whispered my name. I gestured for him to come in, and he moved slowly, as if he didn't want to turn his back on the hallway. He told me he'd heard something coming from his closet. I tried to reassure him, explaining that houses often make noises as they settle. He shook his head quickly and insisted it wasn't like that. It sounded more like scratching. Even then, I assumed it was just an overactive imagination. I told him there were no monsters in his closet and asked if he wanted me to check. He nodded, and I walked him back to his room. I turned on the overhead light and faced the closet. Both sliding doors were closed. I slid one open and glanced inside. I didn't linger long because I knew no one was there, just clothes. I even moved a few things aside to make it look convincing. When I closed the door again, I could see the relief wash over his face. I tucked him back into bed and returned to the guest room. 15 minutes later, though, I heard footsteps again. This time, Charlie entered more quickly, visibly more upset. He said, "Chris, the closet door moved." I sat up, suppressing a flicker of irritation. I reminded myself to stay calm and patient. I told him we'd go check again. We walked back down the hallway, and when we reached his room, I stopped in the doorway. One of the closet doors was wide open, pushed completely to the side. I stared at it, feeling my stomach sink, not because I immediately thought someone was hiding there, but because it wasn't how I'd left it. I knew I'd closed it. I asked Charlie why he'd opened it, my tone sharper than I intended. He swore he hadn't, and the way he said it didn't sound like a lie. I walked over and slid the closet door shut. What bothered me was how it felt. It didn't seem loose enough to open on its own. I gave Charlie a look, meant to suggest I knew he was just playing with the door, maybe trying to scare me. I tucked him in again, told him he was fine, and insisted he go to sleep. As I walked back toward the guest room, I realized I was listening intently for footsteps behind me, like someone else was in the hallway. I told myself to calm down. I was 15, in a family friend's home, on a quiet street. About 10 minutes later, instead of footsteps, I heard Charlie call out. It wasn't a scream, more like a trembling, raised voice, as if he was trying not to shout, but needed me. It came from his room. I got up immediately and walked down the hallway. As I approached, I could hear him crying softly. I stepped into his room and saw him sitting upright in bed, tears streaking his face. My eyes went straight to the closet. The door was closed. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lifted his arm and pointed toward the corner of the room. I followed his finger, and for a moment, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. The hamper sat in the corner, and behind it, pressed tightly into the narrow space between the hamper and the wall, was a person, crouched low. They were concealed, pressing themselves down as tightly as they could. The first thing that caught my eye was a shoulder, then a pair of shoes, and then part of his face, mostly hidden, except for his eyes. Those eyes were fixed directly on me. It all happened in maybe 2 seconds before instinct took over. I didn't scream. I just knew it was time to move. I wrapped both arms around Charlie, pulled him out of bed, and lifted him like he weighed nothing. I stepped backward toward the door, never breaking eye contact with that corner. The person didn't move right away, which was almost worse. They stayed crouched, like if they didn't shift an inch, I might somehow forget they were there. I ran to the guest room, locked the door, and tried to keep Charlie quiet while I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher there was someone inside the house. I gave her the address and explained that I was babysitting, and there was a man in the child's bedroom. She asked if I saw a weapon. I told her I wasn't sure. She asked if we were safe. I said we were locked in an upstairs bedroom. She told me not to hang up. I kept waiting for the doorknob to twist or for the door to rattle. The dispatcher kept talking, trying to calm me, asking me to describe the intruder. But I couldn't. All I could manage was saying I saw eyes behind a laundry hamper. Hearing the sirens growing louder in the distance was the first time police sirens had ever made me feel relieved. The dispatcher told me not to open the door until an officer identified themselves. When the police finally came upstairs, one of them knocked and said my name, Chris. Since dispatch apparently had it, I unlocked the door and opened it to see two officers holding flashlights. They looked past me into the room, then down at Charlie. They told me they had already searched downstairs and found no one. The front door had been wide open, so there was no need to force entry. They checked every possible place someone could hide. Whoever it was had already fled. Based on the timing, they said he likely bolted as soon as I went down the stairs, and escaped through the front door. When Mark and Diane arrived home, they pulled up to police cars outside and officers standing in their living room. The air was heavy with emotion. Mark asked me questions I couldn't really answer, just like the police had. One officer asked about the locks and how someone could have gotten in. Mark immediately went to the back door to check it. I followed because I felt like I needed to see it too. The top deadbolt was unlocked. Mark looked at me and asked, "Did you lock both locks, like I told you?" I said, "I locked the bottom one." He replied, "The bottom one pops open if the knob gets shaken. That's why I said both." He didn't yell, but I could tell he was upset. Still, it didn't last long, and he kept saying how grateful he was that I got Charlie out safely. The worst part is imagining what could have happened if Charlie hadn't come to get me, if he'd stayed in his room, trying to be brave while that person was hiding in there, or if I'd been downstairs distracted on my phone, not paying attention, or if I'd told Charlie to just go back to bed without checking. So, to parents, babysitters, or anyone responsible for kids, don't always brush off what they say as just imagination. The third time I babysat AJ was the only time I was ever asked to stay overnight at someone else's house. It was also the very last time I ever babysat anyone. I was 17, a high school senior, and I'd already watched AJ twice before. He was 8 years old, quiet, and the kind of kid who avoided eye contact when you spoke to him. The first time I met his mom, she explained that he was a loner who mostly kept to himself, so I shouldn't expect much interaction. She said it like it was a positive thing, like it meant the job would be simple. And honestly, the first 2 times were. I hardly had to do anything besides heat up food and remind him when it was time for bed. He'd stay in his room for hours playing video games like Grand Theft Auto. The third time was different because his mom asked if I could stay the night. She said she had to travel for work and wouldn't be back until late the next morning. She sounded stressed on the phone, like she didn't have many options. So I agreed. I assumed it would be the same routine, just longer and better pay. When I arrived that afternoon, she rushed through everything at the kitchen counter while AJ was already upstairs. She said there was frozen pizza in the freezer, that he usually ate cereal for breakfast, and that I could sleep in the spare room at the end of the hallway. She thanked me 3 times before she even left. After she was gone, I called upstairs to tell AJ I was there, even though he already knew. He just yelled back a quick, "Yeah," without coming down. For the next few hours, I barely saw him. I could hear his video games through the ceiling, gunshots and crashing cars echoing from his room. At one point, I went upstairs to check on him and saw him sitting on his bedroom floor, controller in his hands, eyes glued to the screen. He didn't look away when I asked if he was okay. He just nodded, still staring at the TV. I went back downstairs and tried watching something in the living room, but staying overnight in someone else's house felt unsettling. Around 7, I made the pizza and called AJ down. When he came downstairs, he didn't greet me. He grabbed 2 slices, looked at me with an expression I still can't quite explain, like I'd somehow annoyed him just by being there, and then went back upstairs without saying a word. He was colder than usual this time. I stood alone in the kitchen, holding my plate, feeling awkward and out of place in a house I was supposed to be responsible for that night. I brushed it off, assuming he was just a strange kid. After cleaning up, I went upstairs to get ready for bed. The guest room was small and plain. I left the door partially open because I didn't like the feeling of being completely shut in. I was sitting on the bed, talking to my friend Bree, when I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. I looked up and saw AJ's head slowly pull back out of sight from the crack in the doorway. He'd been standing there, staring in. I laughed nervously because it startled me more than anything, and I called out, asking what he was doing. He didn't respond. I heard quiet footsteps moving down the hallway toward his room. I remember thinking it was kind of funny, like he was just being a curious kid, and I didn't think about it again. Around 11, I put my phone away and turned off the lamp. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep. I don't know how long passed before I sensed I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. It took me a moment to realize that there was actually someone standing there. Before I could stop myself, I screamed and frantically reached for the lamp. When I switched it on, AJ was standing motionless at the foot of the bed. The expression on his face is still difficult to explain. He looked irritated, but at the same time frightened or remorseful, like he knew what he was about to do was wrong. Both of his hands were hidden behind his back. I sat upright and demanded to know what he was doing in my room. He didn't respond. I told him to show me what he was hiding. He slowly shook his head, no, never breaking eye contact. That silence scared me more than if he had started yelling or crying. I climbed out of bed and walked toward him, telling him he needed to return to his room immediately. When I reached him, I grabbed his arm and turned him slightly. That's when I noticed the handle of a large kitchen knife clenched in his hand. I screamed again, instinctively covering my mouth without thinking. I shouted at him to get out, to leave my room, to go. My entire body was trembling. He didn't protest. He simply bolted into the hallway, still gripping the knife. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly as I tried to call his mom that I could barely hold my phone. When she answered, I struggled to speak. I told her that AJ had come into my room with a knife while I was asleep. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her tone shifted completely. She sounded horrified, like she'd feared something terrible might happen, but not something this extreme. She kept apologizing repeatedly, telling me how sorry she was and that she believed me. I told her I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't care about the money or anything else. I just needed someone else to come take over. She didn't argue at all. She said she would call her ex-husband and have him come immediately. I stayed locked in that room for nearly an hour, terrified out of my mind. Eventually, I heard a knock at the front door and a man calling AJ's name. I cracked the guest room door open and saw a man I recognized from a photograph in the house. He went straight down the hallway toward AJ's room without really acknowledging me. I grabbed my bag, walked past them without looking into AJ's room, and left the house as fast as I could. His mom sent me the money later that night through Venmo, along with another long apology, but I never returned. I never babysat for another family after that either. I honestly feel like I was inches away from becoming a headline about a babysitter being killed by a child. I was 21 years old when my sister asked me to watch her kids overnight while she and her husband attended a wedding a few hours away. I had watched my niece, Emma, and my nephew, Lucas, many times before, so it didn't seem like a big deal. Emma was 6, quiet and sensitive, and Lucas was 9, more talkative, but still easy to handle. They lived in a typical suburban house in a calm neighborhood not far from where we grew up. Before leaving, my sister went over the usual routine since I'd be staying the night. Leftover Chinese food for dinner, no scary TV, and bedtime at 9 o'clock. She reminded me that Emma sometimes got anxious at night and might call for me once or twice. After they left, we ate dinner in the living room and watched a movie. Everything felt completely normal. Around 9 o'clock, I took them upstairs. Their bedrooms were across from each other, with a bathroom between them. I tucked Emma in first. She asked me to leave her door slightly open and keep the hallway light on. Lucas just turned over and said goodnight, already sounding half asleep. I went back downstairs and turned the TV on low so it wouldn't disturb them. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, I heard footsteps upstairs. I assumed Emma needed something. I started up the stairs, but before I reached the halfway point, I saw her walking along the upstairs balcony toward the stairs. She stood there in her pajamas, staring down at me. I asked what was wrong. She said I had already come into her room and told her to go back to sleep, but she still couldn't. I stopped on the stairs and told her I hadn't been upstairs since putting them to bed. At first, she thought I was joking. She said I had stood in her doorway a few minutes earlier and whispered that everything was okay. I told her she must have dreamed it and guided her back to her room. I checked her closet and under the bed even though I knew nothing would be there. She eventually laid back down, but she watched me closely as I left, like she wasn't convinced. I went back downstairs feeling a little uneasy, but I kept telling myself kids confuse dreams and reality all the time. About 20 minutes later, Lucas came downstairs rubbing his eyes. He asked why I had gone into his room. A chill ran through me. I told him I hadn't. He said I stood by his dresser, looked at him, and then walked out without saying anything. I tried to keep my voice steady and told him he must have been half asleep. But now it felt strange because both kids described similar things. Instead of returning to bed, he sat next to me on the couch. That's when I really started paying attention to the house. Every little noise felt amplified. I turned off the TV, and the silence was so intense, it made my ears ring. Lucas noticed and looked uneasy when I told him to be quiet for a second. That's when I heard something upstairs. Light footsteps running. Then I saw Emma sprint across the upstairs balcony and down the stairs screaming Uncle Dan over and over. When she reached the living room, I asked what was wrong, and she burst into tears, saying there was someone upstairs. That was when my heart truly started pounding. This wasn't some harmless kid prank. She was genuinely terrified. I asked her why she thought someone was upstairs, and she said someone had come into her room again and said goodnight. But it didn't sound like me. By now I was internally freaking out, but I tried to keep them calm. I didn't want Emma's fear to make Lucas start crying too. I told them to stay downstairs while I checked upstairs and came right back. That was the plan. But I wasn't going up there unarmed. I went into the kitchen quietly grabbed a knife and held it in front of me as I walked back into the living room and then up the stairs. The kids stayed on the couch. I reached the upstairs balcony that overlooked the living room. I did a silly march across it, hoping to make them laugh, but it didn't help. As I moved past the balcony into the upstairs hallway leading to the kids' rooms, I can't stress enough how unprepared I was for what happened next. I heard something inside Emma's room. I peeked in and thought I saw a shape or a person. I quietly said hello so the kids wouldn't hear me, fully expecting no response. Instead, in a strange, high-pitched voice that still sounded like an adult man, someone said, "Aren't they just so special?" The voice sounded disturbed, like it belonged to someone not fully there mentally. That's when I realized the figure in the room was a very tall person, standing next to Emma's bed. I'd guess around 6'4", at least 6 inches taller than me. My heart felt like it jumped into my throat. I spun around, ran downstairs, and grabbed the kids. I told them to put their shoes on immediately because we were leaving. Emma started crying even harder, and I quickly understood why. Peeking around the upstairs wall was that grotesque-looking man playing peekaboo with his hands toward the kids. I yelled to forget the shoes and ran outside with them in their socks. We sprinted to a house a couple doors down where the lights were on, and I rang the doorbell 5 times. The woman who answered recognized Lucas and Emma. I introduced myself and quickly explained what was happening. She let us inside without hesitation. I called 911 and stood on her front porch, watching my sister's house. I then saw the man casually walk out, heading down the walkway and disappearing into the darkness in the opposite direction. The 911 operator told me not to approach him and said officers were on the way. To this day, I regret listening. I should have followed that creep. I should have confronted him. But realistically, I didn't know if he was armed. And based on his voice, I chose to believe he was a mentally disabled person who wandered into the house. I stayed on the porch watching him until he vanished down a side street and told the operator which direction he went. She made it sound like police would head that way, but it took so long for them to arrive that he was long gone, possibly into another house nearby. I was unhappy with how long it took and told the police that directly. I went back into my sister's house with them to search, but nothing seemed out of place, and no one else was inside. Given everything, I took the kids to my parents' house to sleep that night. There was no chance we were staying there. Somehow, blame still landed on me that the one night I babysat, someone broke in. But I firmly believe that man was already inside before I arrived. I didn't leave doors unlocked or do anything careless. Since then, my sister and brother-in-law have gone overboard with security cameras. They have at least 6 inside and outside the house. And honestly, after that night, who could blame them?